Quantum mechanics.
Yes, we are the Quantum Mechanics. We're the paranormal podcast that kicks the tyres of the strange and the unexplained. And we're going to talk about something close to my heart, something near my old stomping ground in North London, Highgate, right, Ben?
Yeah, Highgate, yeah. So, I think with world events as they are, and following on from a previous episode, I always said that I wanted to have a look at the Highgate Vampire story, which was, I would say that it is, you could class it as a story which really revolves around, I'm not sure it's mass hysteria, but certainly hype and press involvement and a whole load of people perhaps chasing wild geese. But when I really got into it, I found out that there was a lot more to it than might meet the eye. And yeah, I thought I would tell you about it because it's fascinating.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, no, I remember we did talk about it as potentially being featured in the episode that we did on mass hysteria, but sounds like it was good we didn't, because it sounds wider than
It is wider than that, yeah. And it involves two really strong characters who I will come on to later. And I'm pretty well versed in the lore of a lot of these sort of sightings in London, and none of this had crossed my path before, so I was pretty interested. But the story really starts in earnest in February in 1970, and the Hampstead and Highgate Express running a headline that it says, "Does a vampire walk in Highgate?" And this, I think, we can trace to the very first moment where people start getting their interest piqued. So this is, I think this is fairly typical of the press at the time. Like, we've spoken about things like the Enfield poltergeist and stuff, where the press are paying for people to go in and investigate. And this is a sort of a high time between the early 70s and the early 80s, when newspapers are really enjoying these stories. And we've spoken before about, how it's a distraction from perhaps the Cold War fear and all that sort of thing.
I also wonder, in that time period, it was the start of, more serious, let's say, or mainstream movies, featuring the kind of paranormal and
absolutely
horror. Whereas they'd always been kind of the B movies of the 50s and 60s. You had movies coming through which were taking it a bit more seriously, or at least to higher levels of entertainment.
Absolutely. And this is an era where, you're quite right, we have things like The Wicker Man, which are making horror a little less abstract, I think, is probably a great way to put it. But this area of Highgate, there is a backstory to this. This headline isn't where it starts. That's where it starts for the people who were involved, and the people who are looking on and reading the headlines. But for years, this area was plagued with kind of inexplicable events and sightings.
Nothing to do with me, I'd like to say.
No. Well, this is definitely before your time,
Okay,
because
good.
and it's around the Highgate Cemetery. So in 1967, two adolescent girls walking home along Swains Lane, which sort of cuts across the front of the cemetery, they appear to have they claim to have witnessed the dead rising from their graves by the cemetery's north gate, which is a fairly extreme claim to make, but that was nevertheless what they said. And another teenager who was living nearby woke one night and claimed that something cold and clinging was holding onto her hands, and it left prominent marks the next morning. And the background to all of this was that there were various random reports from unnamed people, as far as I can find out, talking about a tall man in a hat walking in the area.
we've heard of this before, right?
We have, yes, but I think in this
Different
case, it's a different hat, yes.
Before you go on to that, I actually have quite a funny story of a friend of mine who saw a ghostly apparition in Highgate Cemetery. So
I didn't know about this.
So for those of you who don't know, Highgate Cemetery is quite famous, and you can go for tours of it. It has some famous buried inhabitants. I guess the most famous is Karl Marx is buried there, right? So, but a friend of mine, Alan, who him and his friends got very drunk one night and decided for a laugh they'd go and see Karl Marx's gravestone in Highgate Cemetery. So it's quite a high walled thing. So they managed to scale the walls and get into the cemetery, and in their drunken stupor they were walking through, and then my friend Alan saw this glowing green, wasn't like a mist, he just said one of the gravestones started glowing and pulsating in green, and he
My God.
and him and his friends all saw it. They all panicked and just ran like hell, rescaled the walls and headed home.
The Karl Marx Memorial, of course, is in the Eastern Cemetery, on the other side of Swains Lane and further down. And as far as we can tell, had no association whatsoever with the hauntings, and certainly not the vampire contagion, which was entirely, exclusively in the Western Cemetery, further up Swains Lane and on the other side.
Sober the next day, they did a bit of research, and apparently some of the gravestones in Highgate Cemetery are painted with luminous paint. So all he'd seen is the natural phenomena of a gravestone that was painted in luminous paint, but in their drunken stupor and their, highly sensitised kind of scared state, they started to believe that this gravestone just started to kind of pulsate in a kind of green glowing aura.
To be fair, that is pretty terrifying. Why are they painted with
I've
luminous
got
paint?
no idea. I could never find out why people would do that, unless it was, maybe some people have got a kind of
A wicked sense of humour.
a wicked sense of humour that they want to keep going once they're dead. I don't know.
Wow. Gosh, I had no idea. But that is really interesting. I love that story. Well, going back to the early 70s.
Yeah.
So this man in a hat was seen melting into the cemetery walls. That's what the eyewitnesses say.
Right.
But it didn't stop there.
The spectral figure, seemingly wearing a top hat, was contained within one report by one witness. There were no others.
The situation got a bit nastier, and by the early months of 1970, animals were being found dead, and their bodies were found drained of blood, and they had lacerations to their throats.
Right.
And this is where, on the 6th of February, our first protagonist enters the scene, David Farrant. And he was a local man and a self-proclaimed magician.
Right.
And he wrote in the Ham and High newspaper, or rather he wrote a letter to the Ham and High newspaper, that he had recently glimpsed a grey figure he was certain was supernatural, and a belief shared by several concerned residents in the letters page. So he begins this thread where he starts lending credence to the fact that he has seen something peculiar in this in this cemetery.
What is left out of that is the fact that the last paragraph of the same letter to the editor that was published, yes, on February the 6th, the writer of that correspondence owned that he had no knowledge in this field and invited those that did to contribute something.
So this kind of accelerates the ball rolling from the teenagers who had experiences.
That's right. That's right. And all of this, because don't forget, the newspaper have already set out their editorial stance here with their headline: "Does a vampire live here?" And so this is all putting kindling to the flames.
As far as I recall, there were very few people in their teens. In fact, I can't recall any. Most people were in their 20s and 30s who wrote to the newspaper or otherwise contacted myself and gave testimony to something happening eerily in Swains Lane or beyond. This use of the word teenagers is very misleading. I was unaware of any teenagers. Ferrand himself was 24 and I was that bit older, in my mid-20s.
But his account, it's not the only one, and this is where the second person comes in. So he has a rival, and this is a man who is a self-proclaimed exorcist, a vampire hunter, and he calls himself a bishop of the Old Catholic Church.
I was none of those things because I didn't proclaim myself to be so, and did not enter holy orders for some years yet to come. So I clearly wasn't and couldn't have been a bishop. And I didn't go around calling myself a vampire hunter or an exorcist, though in time that is how others might and did identify me.
Right.
And his name is Seán Manchester.
Right.
And he writes a letter to the same newspaper, the Ham and High.
Incorrect. I wrote no letter to the Hampstead and Highgate Express. I was invited by its editor, Jerry Eiserman, to drop by at the office and have a casual chat in the evening, which led to the front page headline and feature article on the 27th of February. There was no letter from me whatsoever. I was not interested in the slightest in cultivating any form of publicity.
And he says, it became appallingly apparent that the people of Highgate were not witnessing a harmless earthbound apparition, but a vampire. And so this is the first time where we start attaching people with whatever their credibility is, and it's a self-proclaimed credibility. They begin to start taking this very seriously. And this is all happening in the letter section in the Ham and High newspaper.
So if I go back to the chronology of this, out of these two men,
It was not all happening in the letters columns. In fact, my contribution was, for the first 3 weeks, maybe more, contained on the front page in articles under headlines that referred to what was going on from my perspective. In the first article, Does a Vampire Walk in Highgate?, made no mention of David Ferrand. It mentioned in passing the Reverend Christopher Neil Smith. It mentioned Montague Summers, also an exorcist, but in a previous time. But there was no letters from me in the letter columns. They were from others.
The magician.
Yeah,
And-
Farrant and the exorcist Manchester.
And the exorcist Manchester. Did they? Who got the letter in first, or did they kind of both come at the same time? Do you know?
No, Farrant gets his letter in first.
And he's
But-
the magician.
He's the magician.
No, Farrant wrote to the Ham and High newspaper, or rather wrote to the editor of the Hampstead and Highgate Express, and was published early in February. I did not. That is the fact. I did not. Gerald Eisenman merely asked if I would drop by after hours, and as it was not terribly inconvenient, though I was on my way with somebody to, well, the Royal Opera House actually, and I did that. I didn't know, I had no idea whatsoever that the next edition of the Hampstead and Highgate Express would carry my photograph and a feature article. That to me was a complete surprise and something of a shock actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
But then
I'm sorry. Can I go back as well? Because you said he was what he claims to be a bishop in the early Catholic Church?
the
What is
old
that?
Catholic Church.
No, I made no such claim at that time. How could I? I was not in holy orders. It would be 3 years or so before I was even in minor orders. And I wasn't a bishop, episcopally consecrated, until October 1991. They're talking about a history some at least 20 years earlier.
What is the old Catholic Church? Do we
I
know?
don't know, and I can't find out because
Not true. Anyone could find out, and anyone within ecclesiastical circles would know anyway that the old Catholic Church broke away from Rome 3 centuries thereabouts ago for various reasons, not least of all the universal jurisdiction of the Pope, which it rejected, and other matters that it did not want to modernise toward. And anyone who knows their onions, much less their garlic, would know what the old Catholic Church is. It's not the modern Church of Rome. But of course we're dealing with very ignorant people who didn't even bother to read my book, didn't even bother to ask me any questions by whatever means, email or my Q&A group, where they could have quite easily done that had they not chosen to remain utterly anonymous. We only knew them and know them still as Ben and Pete, a bit like Dud and Pete. So there you have it.
it isn't particularly clear.
Isn't the Catholic Church the old Catholic Church?
You would think. Well, later on in this episode, I will be playing a piece of an interview that he did where he talks about this vampire, and it was conducted by the BBC in 1990.
Right.
And also David Farrant created his own, I guess you would call it documentary, but it is in the loosest possible sense a documentary, where he talks about what he saw. It has to be noted at this point that I have reached out to the remaining person alive, which is the Reverend Manchester, for an interview, and I haven't had the most positive of responses. So,
By reaching out, he sent a message anonymously using the quantum mechanics logo and nothing else. And I advised him to join my Q&A group, which is private. Nobody else can see it except those members that belong to it. And I would certainly answer any question he has on any subject whatsoever. This applies to everyone, apart from trolls, of course. And he chose not to do so. And the reason he chose not to do so is because he didn't want to reveal his own identity. It's quite all right to reveal mine on his podcast and to discuss it incorrectly at length, but he doesn't want to reveal privately to me his full name. And it's not fair to impose that condition on others and then not on him. And it was explained, if I know, nobody else will be privy to this information, but if I know who you are and whom I'm talking to, then all is well. Ask any question you want. He chose to remain anonymous and to not proceed. That is the fact.
I'm not certain he wishes to talk about this any further, and we might find out why as we go through the story. But what is
You upset him, Ben.
well, I think I upset him by approaching him in the wrong way via a social media channel, although I thought I was perfectly polite. But anyway.
I've told you've got to be careful when you're bashing the bishop.
Never heard that before.
I apologise immediately for that.
Oh dear, it's turned into an episode of Viz.
You really have. Alright, carry on. Literally.
But as with all of these things, the newspaper reports turn into television. And this reaches something of a fever pitch by Friday the 13th of February 1970, and I don't think that date is an accident. Yeah. Thames Television ran a programme about this unfolding saga.
Actually, it was not in February. Friday the 13th was in March, the following March.
And what they are reporting on is the fact that both Manchester and Farrant declared that they would destroy the evil figure, as they both put it, by stalking Highgate.
So they claiming they're going to become North London's answer to Van Helsing. Is that
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. Okay. So Farron at this point he's rubbishing any notion of it's quoted as him saying a real Hammer horror style vampire. So he is saying that isn't what's happening, whereas Manchester is saying, yeah, I think that is exactly what's happening, and he starts referring to this case as he talks about this entity as a satanic being, and so what we now get is another level of sort of interplay. We've got two factions. We've got Farron, who is claiming to be a magician and saying this thing is real, but it's not like a vampire that's going to come and fly in through your window as a bat. And we've got Manchester, who is sort of carrying with him the credibility of being like this exorcist and this religious figure, and he says it is. And then we get the television involved. So we've got the paper involved, now the television are involved.
You can see why TV got involved. It's got loads of it's got fantastic tropes, especially the character Manchester, being this religious connotation to him, and thinking about it in the more kind of traditional, let's say, movie-esque tropes of a vampire, and somebody who's kind of coming at it from a more alternative edge. It's perfect, right?
Absolutely, it's perfect. Yes, and today I think perhaps like Thames TV it's obviously a mainstream thing. If you were around in the UK in the early 1970s, you had 2, possibly 3 channels if you were very lucky, and so there aren't all the plethora of digital channels and whatever. And I think perhaps the reason this comes about is because it's a lively topic. It's almost like you can make it as an extension of the "and finally" section on a news piece, but it turns into something much bigger. So by the end of that programme, and within hours of the broadcast, the police realised that this might be a problem for the cemetery. They assemble a police cordon around the cemetery, but
Wow.
dozens of self-proclaimed vampire hunters turning up with homemade stakes and coming from all over London break through that cordon and start searching the cemetery for this Nosferatu.
Utter nonsense. The police didn't arrive till considerably later on, after individuals had begun to assemble at the North Gate, and only a very small number had any intention of dealing with what they believed was a vampire, what everyone believed was a vampire within.
You have this old movie trope gang, almost pitchfork carrying gang trying to get after this vampire. That's perfect, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's a really, for anybody who is a bit bored on a Friday night, the notion of going down and looking for a real vampire, something which, you've kind of seen in the movies, and it has a romanticism to it, and the idea it's the sort of the absolute epitome of turning up with pitchforks to run out of town the thing that you don't want. And this is exactly what happened. Later that year, so this is February, and this
is March. Stay awake.
This doesn't calm down for a good while. The newspapers are all over this, and the news of the world start getting involved because, of course,
The news of the world did not get involved.
Yeah, so again, for listeners outside the UK, the News of the World was, one of the biggest tabloid newspapers. It came out on a Sunday. I guess a little bit, it's the American version, a bit National Enquiry, right? Or is that too extreme?
No, I think that's right. Although it had a reputation for doing good undercover journalism, so it wasn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't completely, vampire hunting. But later that year, in August 1970, a woman's century-old remains were discovered desecrated near her grave. And then, a few weeks later, Farron himself was arrested.
Not a few weeks later, a few days later, on August the 17th. Even the slightest piece of research would have revealed that fact.
In a nearby churchyard, carrying a crucifix and a wooden stake. And he ended up suing the News of the World because the News of the World ran a story where they claimed that he would be a would-be cat killer.
This is totally disconnected, had nothing to do with vampires, and was not in the same time period. Ferrant sued the News of the World and the Daily Express. I believe he lost the latter one, because of stories they ran about his girlfriend Martine de Sassy, or what she said. And although it had a witchcraft association and plenty of nudity, it had absolutely nothing to do with Highgate or the vampire case, as much as these people, Ben and Pete, try to make it so. And we are talking about some years later.
So they had kind of deviated away from the vampire story, which was kind of rapidly running out of steam because
they were never running the vampire story.
there wasn't a vampire found. And they were beginning to focus in on these two characters.
There was a vampire found, and they didn't focus in on two characters. They later focused in, quite separately, on one of them, not I, entirely due to witchcraft claims and claims of a girl who was the girlfriend of the other person, talking about rituals which involved the sacrifice of animals, had absolutely no connection to the vampire case whatsoever.
And Farrant was the first one to feel the wrath, basically.
Well, you can understand why. Again, you know, if you're arrested, he said, for wandering around with a kind of stake and a crucifix.
He was arrested on the 17th of August 1970 in possession of a wooden stake, cross and rosary. He would later be acquitted. So to confuse what happened in August 1970 with what later happened is very misleading and atrocious reportage.
Crucifix or cross, you can see why, as a tabloid journalist or news editor, you might just go, hey, hold on a second, these guys are more interesting than the story.
Absolutely, yeah, and they give it life beyond where it's gone, because by August, yes, there are people who are going out. It's a bit like today, where I suppose after shows like Most Haunted and Ghost Adventures, lots of people go ghost hunting and they take with them various things which are, you know, K2 meters and stuff. I have one myself, but it's fairly, I would say, innocuous. It's fine, isn't it? You go to an old hotel and see if you can see anything in the middle of the night. Whereas I think it's a little bit different when you've got a lot of people turning up to a cemetery in central London, and some of them really believing that they're going to, you know, essentially exterminate a member of the undead. It can get into a very dangerous situation quite quickly. So,
well, like you said, that the mass hysteria episode we did, there was that other story in London about the incident that happened in Hammersmith, where the Hammersmith ghost, where somebody did end up in the dock and charged with murder because they thought they'd shot or taken out a ghost, which turned out to be somebody just wearing white clothing. You know,
absolutely, yeah.
What you're describing here in Highgate has all the forerunners of ending like that kind of story. If you've got mobs of people, you know, I just wonder what these mobs are expecting to do. They're wandering around a graveyard, you know, God forbid they saw anyone wearing a cloak who was slightly pale, they'd probably have had for them, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think with this, what we've got is a really interesting mix of, we've got sort of young teenagers claiming to have seen, as I say, the dead rising from their graves.
Yeah.
We have numerous sightings of a tall man in a hat who appears to melt into the cemetery walls. That's a actual quote from an eyewitness. We've got another teenager who claims to have woken up with something cold and clinging on her hand, which left prominent marks. And then we've got all of the dead animals, which, you know, it seems like they have some kind of weird way of becoming deceased. And then we get the press involved, we get the television involved, and we have these two characters. And I think that is a really interesting lesson, because it's these two characters that drive this whole legend for at least the next 50 years. So it has to be said, the News of the World and various local newspapers, they do reduce the amount of reporting on this, but then it reaches another kind of fever pitch. But this fever pitch is the full stop on the end of the story, because in 1973, Manchester claims to have driven a stake through the vampire's heart in what he calls the nearby House of Dracula, which...
It wasn't 1973. I did not ever describe the derelict mansion as the House of Dracula. One source, and one source only, described it as such, and that was the Hornsey Journal local newspaper. And that was based on what they were told by nearby residents to the derelict house. So we're just mounting up the error and total misleading statements by Ben and Pete. Wrong year and wrong attribution regarding the House of Dracula, a term I would never use.
She's in Crouch End.
Well, really, I used to live in Crouch End. Where is that?
It was not in Crouch End. Its postcode was N6, which is the postcode for Highgate, and it bordered Hornsey, but not Crouch End.
The
Yeah.
House of Dracula.
So the House of Dracula isn't readily searchable. I have tried to find it, and it isn't really, the address isn't given.
The address was given. It was 1 Avenue Road, N6. The property has since been demolished, or partly demolished, and replaced with a different purpose. It went from being uninhabited, considerably derelict, possibly dangerous, to a development of flats intended for retired elderly folk. Only a part of the facade was retained, very Gothic, for, I suppose, aesthetic reasons.
But I think what is interesting is these two characters who have a different view on it. I think it's best to hear from their own mouths what they think they saw. So the first clip we'll play is from David Farrant, who created a documentary on what he saw. And this clip is him explaining to an interviewer what he thinks he saw.
Have you ever seen this vampire? I have seen it, yes. I saw it last February, and I saw it on 2 occasions. What was it like? It took the form of a tall, grey figure, and it about 8 feet tall, and it seemed to glide off the path without making any noise.
That was not a documentary created by David Farrant. That was a very brief interview he gave on the BBC on the 15th of October 1970 to Lawrence Pickethley. And his was quite a small contribution, but it certainly wasn't a documentary. It was a piece on BBC television, I believe originally called Vampires.
But he certainly sounds like he believes what he's talking about there, man.
Oh, yeah, he absolutely believes what he's talking about. Whether he believes it because he then released a book about it, or whether it was a personal, belief, it's really hard to know. But that is I think, a pretty interesting first-hand account. And I think what we should do is contrast that account from Farrant with one from Seán Manchester. So this is an interview that Seán did in 1990 with the BBC.
But I also gave interviews to the BBC 20 years earlier, which would be contemporaneous with Farrant's interview piece. Somehow they skip that. That is not to be heard. They skip forward 2 decades.
Where he very specifically talks about coming face to face with essentially what he describes as a proper, I guess, to use the parlance that we used before, a proper Hammer horror house vampire. Let's take a listen.
I have never, ever described the vampiric entity as a Hammer horror type vampire. That is their description, not mine.
Well, the Highgate Vampire, when I first looked upon it in its tomb in the Lebanon Circle in the centre of the old Highgate Cemetery, looked like a several-day-old corpse, and had in fact been resting for some century or so. Not in Highgate Cemetery, but it had been in the cemetery for about a century, but it was some centuries older than that. But in fact it looked like, I suppose, a 3-day-old corpse. And I realised that this wasn't a being as we know it, either dead or alive. This was a demonic form, a manifestation from the dark world of the devil.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we've already been misinformed by Ben and Pete that no vampire was found. I'm talking of the very period they were referring to when they said no vampire was found. And of course, a vampire was found.
Why did you realise that? What made you think it was a vampire and not just a 3-day-old corpse?
Because it could leave its tomb without displacing anything. It could manifest.
Did you see it doing that?
It was witnessed by many residents, passers-by, by many people in the general area. On one occasion when it was by the North Gate and the headlights of a car dissolved it. It passed through the iron railings with no problem. A corporeal body or a living person can't do these things. Only a supernatural entity can, as it were, metamorphose.
it kind of raises more questions than it answers, that clip to me.
It does, doesn't it? So,
Actually, it doesn't. It describes for you exactly what a supernatural entity, which is demonic and predatory, ergo a vampire, is.
this is why I think it's quite interesting to put those two accounts of these two protagonists against each other. And what I'm absolutely not saying that Seán is making this stuff up.
I didn't realise we suddenly became on first name terms. But then he withholds his surname, so but that still prevents me from finding it acceptable for a total stranger to address me by my first name, which is a rather intimate thing to do, I'd have thought.
But what is interesting is when he is pressed just a small amount on what it is that he has seen, he slightly buckles at...
No. I am being asked to describe the indescribable. There's no buckling. The supernatural is not described in natural ways. It is beyond the natural, and therefore one has to be very careful in any attempt to give it form in words. It is beyond words of that kind, and one could give the wrong impression by treating it as such. And the last thing I want to do is have people think it's like a Hammer horror movie.
And then attributes sightings to unknown, random other people.
I thought that was interesting because it was almost like you said, once put under pressure, I have to have an explanation. You know what I mean?
Right,
For that,
absolutely.
What pressure? I was put under no pressure whatsoever. I was attempting to describe in my own way what the phenomenon is, even though the phenomenon is indescribable in real terms.
Absolutely. And
And the place he refers to in the nearby Gothic house, is that the Dracula house in my old stomping ground at Crouch End?
Yeah, well, so his conclusion to this story, which he does later relate in his book, is that he tracks this entity down whilst it's on, I presume, a killing spree, and then and puts a stake through his heart. But the evidence is sorely lacking.
Quite the opposite to a killing spree. It had entered what vampirologists call its undead slumber, and was at risk of not being detected or found. It is explained in some detail in my book how it was found, but not by ordinary means.
And I think that's the thing that is so interesting about this, because on the surface of it, we've got a great story, and all of the legend and lore, it all starts from the letters page in a local newspaper, and then from there it becomes really quite flimsy.
No, the letters in the letter columns of the Hampstead and Highgate Express were quite flimsy. They were referring to an unidentified apparition which from letter to letter changed. No two descriptions in the letters column were ever the same. And some of the letters, to say the least, were dubious. one could easily say they were not genuine by any means.
And I just think that is fascinating for like anything that we are looking at in current times. I think with hindsight, when you look back at this, we've got two people who it's not clear what their motivation for making anything up is. And again, I will say it, and I'm not saying either of these people are making it up, but you have to look at the actual evidence presented and what came out of it. And what came out of it was a couple of books and a 50-year history of rivalry and almost petty point scoring between these two people.
Well, none of which can possibly be correct. Yes, I was invited to contribute to Peter Underwood's anthology, and that led to enormous interest from the public and elsewhere, where I was singularly obliged to produce the full story in my own book 5 years later, or even 10 years later actually, because I was being bombarded with correspondence from the general public, and the easiest way to deal with that is to write your account and publish it. But at least it was published in a proper book with a recognisable publisher. The other fellow, just to be accurate here, published a pamphlet that was held together by Staples. I think there is a difference, and in that pamphlet 100 or more lines had been taken directly from my book.
Which really only served them well, because it meant that every time, like that interview there from 1990, which is, 20 years after the initial event, he's still making it. I'm pretty certain that interview is from Radio 1. So he is on primetime national radio talking about this 20 years later. And I don't know, with all of these things, you have to kind of follow the money. I'm not saying that either of them became rich off the back of it, but it's a great story to nail your credentials to the mast with.
Well, David Ferrant certainly didn't make a fortune out of it. He lived very frugally and died in penury, really.
Let's just go back a little bit. So this guy, the Reverend Manchester,
Yeah.
he's wandering about Highgate Cemetery at night, I assume. Didn't really say, did he, in the interview, whether it was day or night?
No, but I would assume night, yeah.
He goes into, which sounds like a kind of crypt or somewhere like that.
Yeah.
He says he sees this body lying there,
A corpse, yeah.
a corpse that looks kind of 3 days old.
Yeah. But he claims it's a century old.
Okay, claims it's a century old. Is he then saying he did the old classic, drove a stake into its heart and somehow it reallocated to Crouch End? Or I got a bit confused at that point.
No, I think so. What he's saying at this point is that he finds this corpse which looks like it's freshly dead, and that it is able to reanimate and get out of wherever it is in a crypt and move around. And when pressed by the interviewer on whether he has seen this activity, he then says that other people have seen this activity, but these other people are there to give their eyewitness accounts. So he is asking us to take for read that these other eyewitness accounts are both credible and real.
Not true. Some of the witnesses have spoken on television. They are recorded in my book. I recorded interviews with them, as did the Discovery Channel, in a very good piece called True Horror Vampires, and they cover the case of the Highgate Vampire. In that documentary, Elzbieta Vaudois, one of the witnesses, speaks. In fact, early vintage recordings of her offering her experiences can be heard, as does, at a slightly later period in time, her then boyfriend, Keith MacLean, and others besides appear elsewhere. So the claim is completely unfounded, but it suits the agenda of Ben and Pete.
Yeah.
And then later on, in 1973, he then claims that he has killed this vampire in a house in Crouch End, the address of which is not available, or at least not readily available, that I've been able to find.
The address is 1 Avenue Road, Highgate, London N6. It's never been a secret, and the reason Ben and his associate haven't found it is because they really are too lazy to look.
And this draws a line under it. But all of this goes into his book.
But again, back to him being in the cemetery, he's looking at this thing, which he believes is, over 1,000-year-old vampire.
No, 100.
100 years, sorry.
Yeah.
100-year-old vampire. So what does he do? He just kind of goes, oh, there's the vampire, and leaves, it seems.
Well, this interview takes place over... There's a good 35-40 minutes of it, which I don't think are necessarily worth going into. But what he is doing at that moment is, from his point of view, he's trying to work out who the vampire is and how he can defeat them. And this is a moment of revelation where he discovers this corpse that looks fresh.
Yeah.
And then he's establishing these eyewitness accounts that it does move and can get out of its surroundings. And then I suppose what one might argue is that to put an end to it, he then needs to find out where, find a safe place to get rid of it. Like, it isn't, for want of trying, that I haven't got his book, but it is it's very nearly £150 second-hand on Amazon, and it's out of print, and I can't find...
The book he is talking about has never been out of print, and due to the coronavirus pandemic is not currently available new on Amazon, but has always been and remains still available from its publisher, Gothic Press.
Find a PDF version of it. So I'm just going on reports and interviews.
The reports.
Yeah, but his whole experience with finding this vampire, tracking it down and killing it are all explained in his book.
That vampire would struggle now to...
What is explained in my book and elsewhere in other books I've written on this subject is that vampires, like any demon, cannot be killed. They can only be quietened, that is, cast out, the demonic element removed through a process known as exorcism. And then anything that is corporeal will return to its normal or natural erstwhile condition as it would have been.
Be a vampire in Crouch End, you know, because it's all hummus and vegan, so there's no way you'd survive as a vampire in Crouch End.
No, that's true. Yeah, well, also as things are going up market, like the chance of you being able to buy a Dracula house, it's going to be difficult, right?
Yeah.
Well, as already established, the area wasn't Crouch End. And the Dracula house, as he absurdly calls it, has long since been demolished.
Yeah, it would be, well, geez, yeah, no, that'd be incredibly difficult. Well, it just gets more intriguing. So it takes him, did you say 3 years to actually finish this thing off in Crouch End, basically?
Yeah, yeah. But it's interesting what you say, because, like, I think it's worth pointing out that Crouch End and Highgate today don't really represent the Highgate of the 1970s.
Yeah.
It was that the cemetery itself, as I understand it, was in deep neglect.
Yeah.
There was rampant vandalism.
Yeah.
And then one of the interesting things I found out was that there were supposed pagan sex parties happening in the middle of the night. It was...
Yeah, there was rumours of that kind of stuff, because there are kind of lots of kind of, you know, I guess what you'd call mausoleum places. You know, it's surprising. I mean, now, you know, certainly I think it's the west side of the cemetery, or I can't remember which side it is, but you know, there are guided tours now that you pay to go around. You have to pay to enter to look around it, because, you know, as I said, in that cemetery in general, there's the graves of Karl Marx, Oscar Wilde.
No, wrong again. The grave of Karl Marx is in the east side, the eastern cemetery, where there are no tours. You can enter without having to pay to go on a tour. The vampire contagion afflicted only the western cemetery. But their research is pretty much non-existent, and they don't really care either.
There's a heap of very famous people who are who are buried there. So yeah, but I think you're right. I think back then it was a very different state of affairs, obviously.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of... I think it's noteworthy that in 1978, David Farrand, he ran as a candidate in Hornsey for his own party, which was the Wicker Workers' Party. And his platform was free sex and nudity, restoring the Wiccan Creed, outlawing communism, establishing state brothels, and strangely leaving the EU common market. And so I think what...
Yeah. He ruined it with that last bit for the Crouch End crowd.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think that sort of tells you, like, that this whole theatre of the vampire and this sort of going head to head with somebody else, it really plays into the characters at the time and what that part of London was at the time. There's
And were both of these guys trying to find and eliminate the vampire, or is it just Bishop?
Yeah, no, they were. But as you heard in that clip, David Farrand thought that it was real, but it wasn't like a satanic entity. He rather comes at it from the point that it's a ethereal being, and that it can be dealt with. He's obviously, as we know from that report from the News of the World, he is definitely using what we would say are vampire hunting techniques. But Manchester is very much on the... This is a satanic thing. He comes at it from I suppose that's the way to put it. He comes at it with a religious tag on all of this, and that religious tag with either his own brand of Catholicism or even probably largely mainstream Catholicism. It talks about like this possessed entity of a dead soul.
And do you think that might tie into their rivalry? Because, you know, like
Yeah.
you said, one sounds like a very kind of a Catholic-based religious angle to him, and the other one sounds very pagan.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And what they are battling for, I think, is not necessarily who kills the vampire, but it's about column inches, and it's about sort of pushing their own belief systems. That's really what it comes down to, I think. And it's
It's an incredible tale.
I suppose that's why I don't give interviews, haven't done so for many years, and eschew all attempts to have me return to radio and television, which I only did in the first place where there was a purpose to it. And I have covered many topics, spiritual topics, historical topics, beside the obvious supernatural ones, although supernaturalism tends to be part of what I talk about. But it isn't the sole thing. Vampirism is not the sole thing I talk about on programmes internationally and at home. But I've ceased doing that for many years, largely because I have never wanted that sort of publicity. But when so much rubbish was being spouted by people like these two, I found it an obligation to set the record straight. But how many times does one need to do that? The record is straight. They just don't wish to report the straight version. Their version is distorted and perverted. But anyone with half a brain would see that for themselves.
Just the characters that you're describing are just incredible, let alone, you know, the idea of a vampire let loose around North London. Just those two characters and the way they're interacting with the tale. It's just, they're brilliant.
Well, it could have got further. So in 1973, the year where Manchester claims to have killed the vampire, and interestingly, the year that The Wicker Man was released.
No, I do not claim to have exorcised the vampire in 1973. Fake news.
We were talking about.
Yeah.
The Farrant and Manchester challenged each other to what they called a magical duel, which was supposed to take place on Parliament Hill.
Wrong. And the event, such as it was, did occur, even though Ben and Pete claim it didn't. It occurred, though, without the presence of David Farrant, which, of course, was his right and his choice.
But it never happened.
Well, did it though? If it's magical, we might not know about
That's
it.
right. We may not know about it.
It did happen. It was reported at the time. I was quoted at the time in the Hampstead and Highgate Express, who had reporters present. Photographs were taken, and I comprehensively refer to it in my book, From Satan to Christ.
But this is where we get right into the realms of Harry Potter. I mean,
I know. It's yeah.
oh, what like?
Did they say how they were going to duel?
No,
Or how a magical duel works.
No, this is part of like this kind of dissing of each other that comes through. And
I explained exactly what I intended to happen, and it was reported. It was reported afterwards by the Hampstead and Highgate Express as well as elsewhere. And that was that I wasn't expecting quite so many people. That was a surprise. But as dusk fell, I formed a ring of prayer using torches, burning torches that is, and attempted a healing, which I was really hoping David Ferrant would also participate in. He didn't. He was afeard of the crowd turning on him and understandably cried off. But that was his choice and I respected that. But I would have liked to have had him present in that healing circle, and said so on many occasions.
And it isn't clear who challenged who first, but they said they would have a magical duel. Now, I think
It's like East Coast, West Coast.
Yeah, it is.
Rap world back in 1970s, but with vampires.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got Farrant on one hand, who calls himself a magician, and from everything I've read, it's a magician with a small c, not a large K.
Not
and so, well, it makes me think that a magician is a magician, right? They are they're a showman, and Paul Daniels never claimed that he was supernatural. He was just a clever person.
Right. So is Farrant more in the Merlin angle? Is that what he means, or more wizardy magician? Or are you not sure?
I'm not sure. Like, I think magician can mean many things, whereas Manchester really believes that he's got, the power of some deity on his side, and I think this is where this comes from. This is like what we get at 1973 is before Manchester has killed the vampire. They're competing for space.
The vampire, I repeat, was not exorcised in 1973. Not long afterwards, but it wasn't 1973.
And credibility with places like the News of the World, who are kind of growing really bored of it, and the TV show is now 3 years old, and the police cordons have gone, and so you've got these two men who have this glimpse of something that they could hang their career hats on.
The most remarkably stupid claim to be made. My career, such as it has been, does not depend on tabloids, which for the most part I have avoided like the plague, and the News of the World were only interested in the claims brought to them by those supposedly engaged in necromancy, black magic and dark witchcraft. No mention of vampires.
Potentially, both of whom get a book deal. This is obviously years before you can do self-publishing.
What book deal are they talking about? Farrant self-published everything he produced from his Muswell Hill bedsit. I had an invitation from the renowned paranormalist Peter Underwood to contribute large portion, 20% of his book on the subject of vampires in 1975, and I did. And the interest in that contribution that I made led to me being singularly obliged to write the full account and in an unexpurgated form, which I did 10 years later, and it was called The Highgate Vampire. And that saved me from endless repetition of answering questions from the public, from everywhere else. Because all there is to say, I say in that book. Let's move on.
So
Yeah.
both of them have secured a book deal, and at the time, like when you talk about all of the fictional material around, so it isn't just the Wicker Man. We've got like Stephen King. I didn't know this. He wrote a short story called Crouch End in 1980.
Wow, I
So
didn't know that.
no, so there's a lot of kind of lore, LORE, being put
Yeah.
on this place, and
And also what you were saying in terms of them continuing to stoke the fire, it gets pretty hard once you've said, no, I've just killed, a few years ago I killed the vampire. You're kind of killing your own story, really, aren't you, in a way? There's no...
I welcome the killing of the story as he describes it, and the exorcism that took place in the 70s, I hoped would allow the story to simply be encompassed by legend and history. I didn't want it to continue, but continue it did because of public demand. And in one way that's understandable, but at the same time, my life is not and has not been predicated on one account, one story. Though I stand by the account I gave to this day.
Nowhere to go from there, is there?
No, absolutely no. There isn't, and I think perhaps at the time, like I think we've spoken about how the media have a role to play in this, and I don't think it's it could be construed as perhaps cynical. Like this is the period with the Enfield poltergeist, don't forget, and the Enfield poltergeist is largely fueled by money from the coppers of papers. They're just trying to sell print. And the Enfield poltergeist, you have a lot to back it up. You've got not only have you got eyewitnesses in terms of the family, but you've also got police officers who were there and saw it. So if you were a newspaper editor at the time, you've got a lot more that you can put on your front page.
There's phenomena that's there, whether it be real or fake. There was
right.
something to see.
That's right. You can write PC blogs saw this and saw that, and you can take a photograph of them and put them on your front page, and that person, wherever they're interviewed, is going to stand up to their story because they believe what they saw. What you've got with this, when we go back to the beginning, again I say, you've got basically their children. They're spoken about as teenagers, but none of them are 18. They're talking about these fanciful notions of people coming back from the dead in their graves, and people, girls having these strange marks left on their hands in the middle of the night. And all of this is very much like, an emo's wet dream. This is exactly what you would say if you wanted to draw attention to yourself. Yeah. And these two men are just changing the focus of the lens away from these eyewitnesses who don't have an awful lot to say, and also their kids, onto...
Well, they're not kids, are they? And I think what they have to say is very convincing, and I invite anyone who is in doubt about that to, for example, watch Discovery Channel's episode on the Highgate Vampire, where you can hear the voice of a very young Elzbieta Vodiwa, and later at the end of the 60s, where she's giving witness to the marks on her neck and the presence at her window. Was she a teenager then? I'm not sure she was. And of course, Keith MacLean speaking many years later on the same programme, as very much in his 40s, 50s, I don't know. And the majority of people who have given witness, one form or another, I would say were young adults to their late 20s, early 30s, with one or two exceptions where they're older than that. And it's completely misleading to believe that we're talking about a bunch of children who claim to have seen something and that's what's being reported. Not at all.
To them, and then what they are falling out over is whether they can, come up with a credible and long-lasting story.
Yeah.
So
You can almost hear the media response in that BBC interview. It sounded like Nicky Campbell to me. I think it probably was, but it in that BBC interview, you could almost hear the interviewer going, "Please say something like, ethereal entity for us." Do you know what I mean? There could be a quiet little snigger, but keeping a serious face to it. Everybody seems to have been, feeding off this like it was, fresh blood for a vampire, basically.
I think if there's any sniggering to be done, it's at the pathetic coverage Ben and Pete are giving this on their quantum mechanics podcast. That deserves a snigger or two, I would say.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's quite interesting when I first started digging into this story. I like the only remaining person alive is Seán Manchester, and the first piece of writing I found from him was he wrote actually quite a nice published eulogy for Farron when he died, and
that's a lovely end to that story.
But Seán Manchester wrote a very reasonable piece about how people misunderstood David Farron, and he didn't have anything against him, and he wished that they could have put their differences to bed. But the reporter who then writes an article about this for Vice is talking about how he had tried to get an interview with Seán Manchester, and this is in the early to mid 2000s when he's trying to do this, and he gets directed to something called the Friends of Seán Manchester Society, and that is exactly who I was referred to when I wrote directly via Facebook Messenger to Seán Manchester. I was directed to this society as well.
Not true. I'm unaware of any such society. He was directed, as was the other fellow whom I did speak to and answer his questions, to a private group, not a society, run by me, which is a Q&A platform where any question on any topic may be put to me by any person, notwithstanding trolls and stalkers. And Ben knew this.
Which is now a Facebook group, which had a number of questions which I wasn't prepared to answer for various reasons. They're incredibly personal.
They're only this personal. What is your name? Is that your correct name? It will not be shared with anyone else in the group. Only I will have that information, just as you have plenty of misinformation about me, and I'm more than willing to correct it for you within the group. But I'm not going to address a completely anonymous person. I think that's reasonable.
And it's basically screening out anybody who wishes to take either an impartial view or like if you listen to the tone of that BBC interview, just the little snippet we've played, you can tell that the interviewer is being slightly playful, and
There's a bit of a snigger to it.
there is a little bit of a snigger, which I'm not sure that's obviously not the way we would have approached it, but later on, Seán gets more and more defensive. He's never combative, but you can see that he isn't happy with the way that it's playing out.
Yet you don't share that, even though what you're saying is not true. Because were you to play it, it would unravel your allegation.
And I wonder whether this kind of this approach, which had been taken obviously by reporters who just wanted to get the story out of him and get the details, because back in 1990, like obviously there aren't such things as podcasts and whatever, and this interviewer is trying to get out of him the juicy details of if you really have come across a vampire, tell us how it was when you killed it, how did you stalk it, how did you do all that.
Absolutely untrue. I have answered all those questions, only more intelligently put, on places like National Geographic, documentaries made in Canada, America, here in Britain, I believe in Korea, South Korea, and in Europe. I have covered all those questions. And I have not shunned any query put to me. But I'm not going to have questions thrust at me from anonymous people whom I don't know, who clearly have an agenda of their own. I think that's a fair enough way to deal with things.
And he just keeps sub-referencing himself and his book, and he doesn't really have any great answers. And I wonder whether the reason why he is behind these barriers now is as I'm saying, that this is one of those cases where we can look at it with two different points of view. We could either say there was some peculiar goings on at Highgate Cemetery and two people captured the imagination of various media outlets and residents of London, and one of them got their man. Or, as I rather suspect, this is a story of people who were trying to build some credibility in their own stories off the back of something which sort of just appeared in the letters page of a local newspaper. And I think it's like, as we've seen, it was very much of its time. It's not something that could happen now because you don't need a paper or a television show. Anybody with a smartphone could go down there and take photographs of anything.
I would remind you again that I did not write letters to the letter columns. Someone else did, others did. And I place very little credibility in those letters. I think some of the names are recognisably people who drank in the Prince of Wales pub, Highgate, and they will put up to it. But that's another story. But the letters in the letters column never spoke about vampires. They spoke about random ghosts of various descriptions. And I personally was not part of that, nor would I be. It lacked seriousness for one thing, and was extremely dubious. My debut was on the front page in a feature article. And likewise my debut on television was on an independent programme on Thames Television hosted by Eamon Andrews, where I consented to answer questions for the viewers. This I continued to do for some time. But there comes a point, surely, when all that can be said has been said. And going over the same repetitive, unimaginative questions, one is obliged to keep giving the same answers. And for how long do we do that? There's a point where we say enough is enough, read my book. However, where Ben is wrong is that I do have a Q&A platform where absolutely anybody apart from troublemakers, who are usually very obvious, I have a platform where I can be presented with any question on any subject at any time, and I will answer it to the best of my ability, and I have done so. So he is quite incorrect in saying what he has been saying.
And so
it's interesting you while you were talking about that, about the kind of two different approaches, and it's something I think with a number of stories that we've covered on the podcast, you know, some of them, yeah, absolutely do feel so outlandish, but they, you know, if there is a grain of truth, it suffers from the way the media, or mainstream media maybe, does approach them. And I totally get when, you know, if I was a tabloid news editor, or, you know, making a mainstream TV programme, or doing a BBC radio interview, you would go with that tone, wouldn't you? Because that, you know, you haven't got the time or the space or the editorial lean to do anything else, right?
Right, absolutely.
Whereas, and that often makes me think with these kind of stories, even the ones where we get, you know, sceptical on, you kind of go, I often think, but God, if there was a grain of truth in that, and like you said, these guys got swept away with all the attention, and it suited the media to then feed off the back of it, and then back it suited these guys because, you know, they're a potential for books and book deals and potentially movie deals, all kinds of stuff, documentaries, that, you know, do you almost create this circle that so confuses the truth? I mean, it's a bit like the UFO phenomena is now. Do you know what I mean?
Well, now match that with the reality. I speak for no one other than myself, but at the time I first appeared, I suppose woke up and found myself famous, on the front page of the Hampstead and Highgate Express, I was, and had been for the previous decade, a professional photographer with a studio in Islington. I also played professionally in a band in the evenings, and at a time when they were the things that everyone really wanted to be in the 60s, and as the 60s entered the next decade for a little while before people woke up and realised it was no longer the 60s, a photographer and or a musician. And I was both those things, and quite successfully so. What on earth would I want the intrusion of the press and journalists knocking on my door for? Why would I need that? And later, as time went on, and I took minor orders in the 70s, and at the turn of the 90s took holy orders, clearly my mindset, my focus is not on seeking publicity with newspaper reporters for whom I've never had the greatest degree of time. And it just makes no sense. And they would realise that if they had any sense, which I doubt they do.
I mean, it's why we don't probably cover it as much on this podcast as maybe we should, because it's almost impossible to kind of filter, to use a remote viewing term, filter out the noise from the signal.
Yes. Oh, 100%. Absolutely it is. And interesting with this Highgate Cemetery phenomena that one of the people, Seán, decides to draw a line under it by claiming to have killed the beast. And that is a very convenient way of...
To end.
Yeah. There are no more sightings. Well, that's because I killed it. How
But
did it end?
did Farron...
Well, that simply isn't the case. Yes, I made it known that the principal primary source, known as the Highgate Vampire, had been successfully exorcised in the mid-70s. But in my book I explain equally that that was not the end, that there was a secondary source in another cemetery known as the Great Northern London Cemetery. And that was a whole nother story. In fact, it's a third of the book, possibly. So it wasn't convenient, as suggested by Ben, that I dispose with the vampire, because there was another, possibly more. The story continued, and my having to attend to what was happening took me into the 80s. They overlooked that conveniently.
Acknowledged
that it had been killed by Manchester or not?
Not really, no. He wrote he brought out his own book, and his tale is a little bit different, but it's...
He brought out no book whatsoever. He brought out a stapled pamphlet, and following that, years later, he brought out a series of booklets. So there was no book deal where the person being referred to is concerned.
More whimsical. Again, the book is phenomenally expensive and only available second-hand, so I haven't bought it, but I have managed to grab pages of it from here and there. And no, he doesn't directly contradict Manchester, but he doesn't go along with the tale that Manchester killed it. No, he talks about it as something much more ethereal. It's not so much a in his mind, it's not so much a corpse that you can stab through the chest.
Well, in the beginning, of course, that's exactly what he described. Hence, he was armed with a stake when he was arrested. But just as his description of the spectre changed from year to year, no red eyes were mentioned in those early days, but they became a part of the description he would share as the years passed. And clearly the interview with Sandra Harris and the next interview with Lawrence Pickethley has him describing a classic vampire. in every sense of the word. In fact, in the first interview, he said it looked like a dead person. This would evolve into energy travelling along ley lines a decade or so later, or maybe more. And that's that inconsistency, for anyone seriously interested in this story, presents problems in itself.
Whether there was a vampire or not seems almost irrelevant. It is about this relationship and development and interactions between these two rivals, you know, to coin a phrase, and their reaction with the media and the story itself. You know, you could see it as a kind of, you know, light, not light in content, but a whimsical British movie, couldn't you? Real life movie. And you know, even the way you described Manchester, you know, writing a eulogy for Farron at the end, you know, that'd be a perfect ending to the whole thing, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, completely. And I think it tells us a lot more about the culture in 1970s Britain, and more specifically 1970s London, than it does about the existence of real vampires.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it reminds me. I mean, I think there is more evidence and doubt when it comes to the story of Jeff the Talking Mongoose, but it has similar elements to that story to me in tone and I don't know how to describe it. Do you know what I mean by that?
I do, yes.
It's got that kind of slight quaintness that Jeff the Talking Mongoose has.
Yes.
To this tale has as well.
Absolutely, and also the fact that we'll never be able to prove or disprove it or discover what was really going on.
But again, a bit like Jeff, I don't really care.
No,
it's the stuff that you're talking about that is the interesting bit, and I care about whether the vampire existed or not, or was laid to rest in Crouch End. You know, and coming from me, who, you know, lived in Crouch End for many years, you think I'd be really wanting to get to the bottom of it. No, it's like I don't really mind. It's what a great tale.
And I'm assuming that you're not undead.
Well, you say that, Ben. It's not red wine I'm sipping while we're sitting here, I'm telling you that much. I want to make that movie. I want to make that movie, or at least if anyone's listening, make that movie. Gets involved, obviously, would be great, but someone should make it. It would be fantastic. Yeah, I'm wondering who you would cast. Who would you cast as Manchester, do you think, if you could choose?
Kevin Eldon.
Yeah, and I was, for either of them, I was seeing a bit of Sir Ian McKellen in there somewhere.
Ooh.
Please.
Probably a bit too old for where this was set.
No, I'd have Sir Ian as the editor of the News of the World.
Oh, good, I like that. Highgate Vampire, the movie.
I thought you were going to say Highgate Vampire, the musical.
Now that would be interesting.
Really?
Great. On that note, I think we will leave you for this week and see you next time on the Quantum Mechanics.
See you next time.
Are you the quantum mechanics?